Welcome, Janine Hamner Holman, CEO, J&J Consulting Group, presenting Are Your People Struggling? Creating a Context for Your Organization to Thrive.
How many of you have ever had a boss who just made you feel like crap? Oh, 2 hands up. I love it. Many of us, suffered with bosses who made us feel less than, who made us feel shame, who made us feel like we weren't doing a great job, even when we knew that we were. When I had that kind of boss, it always reminded me of this poem that I remember from when I was a little kid. The poem is by Longfellow, and it's about the girl with the curl. There once was a girl with a curl in the middle of her forehead. And when she was good, she was very, very good. And when she was bad, she was horrid. And that's what it was like when I was working for, let's call her Pearl with the curl. Because when she was happy with you, it was like being in the sun. She would say, "Oh my God, you guys, look at Janine. She's so awesome. She's so smart. She can do nothing wrong. If you need help, go ask Janine." The problem, though, with being in the sun is that I always knew that the fall was coming. And it wasn't just going to be like from the sun to out of the sun. It was going to be falling as far as you could possibly fall. It was like falling to the outhouse. And like not the happy outhouse with Santa. It was falling to like the old outhouse that hasn't been cleaned in a really long time. And there are spiders. And what was worse was that it was always in public. Just like she would say, "Oh my God, you guys, check out Janine." Then she would say, "Oh my God, you guys, check out Janine." Can you believe what an idiot she is? Can you believe that she turned in this piece of work? Janine is stupid. And she would say it in front of clients. She would say it in front of my colleagues. She would say it in front of people who reported to me. As a result, this is how I felt. I was shamed. I felt humiliated. I felt like I had no worth, even though intellectually I knew I was doing a great job. In the end, this is where I ended up. In a doctor's office, asking for antidepressants to try and manage the situation that I was under. You may think, well, wait, we're HR executives. Why didn't you come to HR? I didn't come to HR because other people had gone to HR and were made to feel this same way. So instead, I went to the doctor's office to ask for antidepressants. Much to my surprise, the doctor actually said, "I am sending you out on immediate medical leave." I'm going to pick up the story from there in a minute. But you may be thinking, well, this sounds a little bit like a personal problem. Like, whatever, Janine, get over it. But here's the problem. Before COVID, these were the rates on the top, these were the rates of depression and anxiety. And you can get all these slides online. 15% of people were depressed at a level at which they needed intervention. They needed help. 29% were anxious at that same level where they needed help, support, and intervention. Now, 41% of people are clinically depressed. And 72% of people are anxious at a level at which we need help. If this was the first day and there were lots of people still in the audience, you could look to your left and look to your right, and at least one of you would be clinically depressed, and at least two of you would be dealing with anxiety. And it might be you. Well, so this is interesting, but the reality is that it has changed from being a personal phenomenon to being an organizational phenomenon. As many of you probably know, the World Health Organization changed its classification of burnout from being a personal phenomenon to being an organizational problem. The organization has not yet dealt with organizational stress. And so we have moved from it being a me problem to it being a we problem. The reality is that our organizations are in trouble. And so the end result of this, in part, is what's being called the Great Resignation. These lines here that are the blue and the green lines represent people who have voluntarily quit their jobs for the last 20 years. So not people who are retiring, not people who are being laid off, not people who are being terminated, but people who are voluntarily quitting their jobs and then planning on going and getting another job. The bright orange line at the top is 2021. The two green dots are the first 2 months of 2022. So what's happening is that now, and March is almost exactly the same. I did this slide about 2 weeks ago, and the numbers hadn't come out yet, but they have now. So for the last 5 months, the reality is 4.5 million people every single month are quitting their jobs voluntarily, whether they have another job lined up or not. And this is about double what it has been for the last 20 years, which is why they're calling it the Great Resignation. So I want us to create a word cloud. If you have your phone on you, you can scan the QR code that is up here, or you can just go to menti.com and put in these numbers, 31602301, and put in there what you think might be the reasons that are leading to the Great Resignation. Why are 4.5 million people every month quitting their jobs? And you can put up to 4 answers in there. So I'm seeing up here money, work-life balance. I'm seeing not liking the commute, wanting a better life, childcare, absolutely. Retirement, remember, these are not people who are retiring. These are people who are voluntarily leaving their job. So this is really similar to the word cloud that got created the last time I did this, which with a bunch of CEOs. And the surprising reality is that according to MIT, who did a study of about 100 different businesses of all sorts of different sizes, the number one reason that people are quitting their jobs, toxic organizational culture. 10.4 times more important relative to compensation. So not just salary, but also benefits, as those of us who are in the compensation world know. 10 and a half more times important than salary is toxic organizational culture. When I presented this to a group of CEOs, this was their reaction. Granted, they were mostly male, but their reaction was like, how could that possibly be? And the first question that they asked me was, okay, but wait, were these all millennials who said this? Like, is that who it is that thinks that culture is so important? And what I said was, it may well be, because here's the reality. In 2.5 years, millennials and the Gen Zs who are coming in after them will be 75% of our workforce. So even if it doesn't make sense to those of us who are a little older, the reality is that this is what matters to 75% of our workforce. So we better figure out what in the world we're going to do about this. Because in 2022, this year, depending upon who's doing the surveying, between 44% and 56% of all employees are planning on quitting their jobs. Half your workforce is planning on quitting this year because of toxic organizational culture. So what's in this bucket called toxic organizational culture? These are actually in priority order from the study that MIT did. The first thing is organizations not doing enough around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. The second is people feeling disrespected. The third is not feeling listened to, obviously right next door to not feeling respected. The fourth is organizations acting in an unethical manner. Organizations being dog eat dog, cutthroat, and actually abusive things happening. So I'm really going to focus on the top three. Inattention to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which was actually significantly more people said that was a problem. And then disrespect and listening. So you may be thinking, but wait, working on belonging, working on respect, working on listening, like our organization's got that. Like, we respect people. People feel like they belong. People feel listened to. No, they don't. The reality is that 90% of the things that collectively we have done for 70 years around diversity have failed. And you guys know this. You're HR. You're the ones who are responsible for bringing the talent in that then leaves. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. 99% of the workforce is experiencing incivility at work. And 91% of employees think that their manager does not listen. So you may think, my organization's got it handled, but your employees don't. So now what do we do? The first thing that I believe, based on my experience, both in the workplace and as a consultant, we get to do is to understand a little bit about how we humans are wired. We are wired like elephants. What do I mean by that? Humans need other humans. We are, in fact, pack animals. We like it when we're all together. We actually need to belong. If you remember back to high school, there was maybe there were the cool kids, maybe there were the jocks, maybe there were the artsy kids, and then there were the outsiders, those folks who didn't need anybody else. But if you think about it, the outsiders also hung together in their group because we need to belong. When we think about diversity efforts, you guys have experienced this. An organization looks around and they say, we need some other kinds of people here. HR, go get us some of those people. And so HR goes and they get women, they get people of color, they get people who are differently abled, they get people who are gay or straight or transgender or whatever it is that the organization thinks that it needs. And then those people come and they look around and they see very few, if any, people who look like them, and none in positions of leadership and power. And so they leave. What if, instead of doing it that way, we changed our focus? What if instead of, we need diversity, let's go get people who are diverse, we start with inclusion and belonging? This is the logo for an organization that I'm actually in the process of forming called the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Professionals Association. For people who do this work to have a place to come together, to belong. What if we started by focusing on inclusion before the people even get here? What if we think about, so what if I were a 7-foot-tall Latino transgender woman from the barrio? What would my experience be like being in this organization? And we got about the business of thinking about how that person could be included with us before we say to HR, go get us some of these people. Because if we do that work on inclusion first, we're going to end up with organizations that actually look like the world. We're going to end up with organizations where all people feel welcomed and belong and where they can stick around and you guys don't have to keep going and recruiting them all the time. When we think about incivility, of course, exists on a continuum. And I said I was going to talk about the three main things that MIT study said. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, number one. Number two, being treated in an uncivil way, disrespected. If we think about my friend Pearl with the curl, she was doing all of these things right up to the physical battery part. She threw a stapler at my head. She certainly made jokes and microaggressions and was cruel at my expense. So these things happen all across a continuum, and we need to think about in our organization, where's the biggest challenge? Is it in the area of microaggressions, which a friend of mine calls intentional acts of inclusion, subtle acts of inclusion? You don't look like a person who would be gay, right? How often do we hear that kind of a comment? That is a microaggression. So we want to think about our organizations and where for us, given that 99% of the workforce is experiencing these issues at work, where are the sticky places for us? Where do we get tripped up as an organization? About 15 years ago, I got really interested in neuroscience. And initially, I was trying to figure out, is my brain different from men's brains? Because like that thing that he just did, no woman would ever do that. Turns out, yes, our brains are different. There are reasons that men do things that men do and women do things that women do. That was super helpful for me. And now in my business, there's all kinds of ways that understanding what our brain does is incredibly helpful. So if someone says something mean and nasty to you, my brain, the most ancient part of my brain, my amygdala, which is way back down here, that's where fight, flight, and freeze live. That part of my brain has no idea that it's 2022. As far as that part of my brain is concerned, we are still all on the Serengeti. And we are really a tribe. And so when someone says something nasty to you, my brain does not differentiate between you and me. We are the same. So when you are being mistreated, my brain sees it as me. That's why when something else is happening, sometimes to somebody over there, we can get triggered. And what happens when we get triggered is literally our brain shuts down. The functioning part of our brain, our prefrontal cortex, shuts down. There's other interesting things in our bodies that shut down too, because we've gotten thrown into fight, flight, and freeze. And back there on the Serengeti, if there's a tiger coming, I don't need to think. I don't need to digest food, which is why sometimes if we get really upset, our stomach feels bad, because we've literally stopped digesting food. This part of our brain has overridden everything. We also can't make babies, which is why sometimes if we're under enormous stress, women in particular have reproductive issues. So there's all these things that happen inside of our bodies, and understanding what the impact is of somebody saying something nasty to you on me over here and on everybody else in the room is critically important, because I'm no longer able to do my job because somebody said something nasty to you, because my brain's shut down. There are all kinds of ways to increase civility. And I believe that one of the best ways to go about it, to start, if you're realizing we have an issue in our organization, is by focusing on what's called psychological safety. This is an idea that was created by Amy Edmondson, who's a professor at the Harvard Business School. And what psychological safety is about is essentially that we want people to raise serious questions, to talk about problems, and to get together to solve them. In order to make that happen, it's gotta be psychologically safe for everyone. But the reality is that most organizations are like my time with Pearl with the Curl, over here in psychological danger, where people would throw each other under the bus, where no one would raise their hand with a question because you might get belittled or shamed, and where nobody ever talked about problems. The problem is, those are the kinds of organizations and the kinds of conditions that were happening at NASA that enabled the Challenger shuttle to blow up. There were people who knew that those rings were going to fail if it got too cold. And news alert, it's cold in space. But they couldn't raise their hand and say, I'm afraid we have a problem here, because it wasn't safe. Here's the thing though. Creating psychological safety, that's a long haul proposition. So how do we start? I believe the best place to start is what the impact was of me in that doctor's office. So I went into the doctor's office because of Pearl with the Curl. Doctor said to me, immediate medical leave. I said, what? I can't possibly, like, what are you talking about? I just need a pill. And the doctor said, well, if I told you you had cancer, would you say, what? I need to think about it. I need to think about if I can have cancer. No, that's not what we say. But, it's one of the things that hopefully we are all getting better at, is understanding the impact on people of mental health issues. And I'd been working with Pearl with the Curl for 8.5 years, which is how I had allowed myself to get into this state. And that's what we do. We become the frog in the pot of boiling water. So when the doctor said to me, immediate medical leave, I said, well, I do need to think about it. And I called my best friend. This is her. We're the kind of best friends who tell each other everything. Even when it's hard, even when we don't want to hear it, we tell each other everything. She had been telling me I needed to go out on medical leave. I hadn't heard her. Because I was so freaked out, I guess, by the idea. I had literally not heard her telling me I needed to go out on medical leave. So when we're thinking about psychological safety, when we're thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, when we're thinking about disrespect and respect and creating a culture of civility, I believe that the easiest way in is to talk about listening. And I want to create a distinction. Listening is not the same thing as hearing. Unless we are hearing impaired, we all hear naturally. We don't have to work at that. It's just something that happens. Listening is very different. Listening is intentional. And the kind of listening that I'm talking about is very intentional. So, how can we get better at listening? The problem is, when most of us are listening, our brains, that voice in your brain, the voice in your head that has many things to say, the voice in our head, while we think we're listening, is also creating a commentary on the world. What's traffic going to be like when I leave here today? Where did she find those shoes? Those are super cute. We're thinking about all kinds of other things. At the same time, we're listening. Our opportunity instead is to get intentional about listening, get mindful, as opposed to mindful about listening. The easiest way to do that is with our breath. So back to neurobiology. When we are thrown into this part of our brain, the fight, flight, or freeze center, our amygdala, if we take a deep breath and then let it out slowly, it allows our brain to reset. It activates our sympathetic nervous system. And if you think about it biologically, this actually makes sense. Because if we're on the Serengeti and there's a tiger coming and you got to run, you are not going to be breathing. You're going to be breathing. So our brain has figured out if we are breathing like that, actually, everything's okay. And we can reset our brain back to the part of our brain, our prefrontal cortex, where we can actually think, where we can make decisions about stuff. And so the easiest way to move from mindful to mindful is through our breath. It's why there's so many different traditions that talk about breathing. Yoga and meditation and all of these wonderful practices that we try and have to manage ourselves all focus on breathing. And that's why, because it allows ourselves to calm down. The other thing that is often happening when we think we're listening, when we're trying to listen, is that we're doing something else. So we might be on our phone, as Dana is. We might be checking email. We might be making a list in our head. I've got to go to the grocery store. What do I need at the grocery store? And what did my son say about that thing? And yeah, I got to go to his play. We're thinking other things and doing other things. We might be balancing our checkbook on our computer while somebody is sitting talking to us. The problem is, if we're supposed to be listening and we're doing something else, our brain literally cannot do that. Your brain is designed to only do one thing at a time. It can do this, and then it can do that. And when you think you're multitasking, what you're actually doing is just flipping really quick from this to that. And I was on a Harvard Business Review webinar, and I took a picture of this slide because I thought it was so brilliant. The more things that we're trying to do at the same time, the more stupider we're getting. Our IQ is dropping each time we add another thing that we're trying to do at the same time, because we're forcing our brain to switch back and forth. And so if you're having a conversation with somebody and you want to be present, you want to be listening, we get to stop multitasking. We get to stop doing other things. It's the reason that people often close their computer or come around to the other side of their desk. We also have an opportunity to listen with an open mind. And that's one of those things that's said, but just like organizational culture, we have a great organizational culture here. One of our speakers was talking about in the earlier session. What the hell does that mean? That means something very different for each organization. Listen with an open mind is that same kind of thing. So when I say listen with an open mind, what I mean is get clear on what your biases are. So it may be that you, like most people in the world, have a judgment about how people look. We all judge people based on how they look. It's a crappy thing that we humans do, but we all do it. Let's tell the truth. And it's also part of how our brain sorts information. So our brain, because there's so much stimulation coming into our brain at any one time, our brain is constantly saying, okay, is she like this other person who I love? Or is she like this other person that I don't love so much? Is this experience like that time when? And our brain is sorting information into buckets. That's why this idea of unconscious bias has become so important. Because, and we want to have this utopian idea. I don't have unconscious biases. Yes, you do. We all do. Do you like green peppers? Do you like Italian food? Those are biases. It's what we like. It's what we gravitate towards. The tricky thing about biases is the more that we can get it out of our unconscious and into our consciousness, then we can make a choice about it. Then we can decide, no, all people who are X are not Y. That's not how human beings are. We are all individuals. So when someone comes and our brain wants to sort them into a bucket, good bucket, bad bucket, pain in the ass bucket, we get to challenge our brain and say, thank you very much, brain. No, I'm actually going to listen from a clean slate. I'm going to take a deep breath. And I'm not going to bring your history with you. I'm going to let your history be. We've heard a lot this 3 days about emotional intelligence. The bedrock of emotional intelligence, the foundation of emotional intelligence is listening. We can't do any of the higher functions. We can't have empathy. We can't make good decisions. We can't have good self-esteem. And we can't express what's going on inside of us to other people unless we can listen, and unless we can listen well. So whether we're thinking that we want to do something around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, or whether we're thinking we want to do something around civility, or whether we think we want to do something around people not feeling listened to, actually the best place to start is that last bucket, is helping people learn how to listen better. And you can make it transparent. You can say, hey, I was at this workshop and I heard this woman talking about listening. And so I'm going to practice getting better at listening. So Dana says something to me, and then I say back to Dana, so what I heard you say, Dana, was da-da-da-da-da. And so then Dana either gets to say, yeah, you totally screwed that up. That's not at all what I said. Or she gets to say, yes, that's exactly what I said. Or more likely, she gets to say, yes, that's what I said. And you missed a point. Or I also meant to say this other part that I forgot. And so Dana then ends up feeling really heard, really seen by me. And we are now connected at a deeper level. So speaking of being connected, I would love to be connected to all of you. If you are interested in having me curate a conversation for your organization around this or around diversity or around a number of different things, please reach out to me. I would love to get to know you. The best place to connect with me is on LinkedIn, or send me an email. There may be some business cards up here somewhere. Yep, right there. And I also have a podcast. And I talk about all these things in my podcast. It's called The Cost of Not Paying Attention, where we look at all the places where we're not paying attention at work and what the cost is of those things to us. So before I leave you today, I want to leave you with this last idea. Most people, when we're listening to somebody share information, we are listening through the lens of, what do I think about that? Do I agree? Do I not agree? Do I think maybe she's got a good idea, or maybe she's full of crap? That's how we listen. Instead of listening to learn. Listening for, okay, so what's important to you? Tell me about your lived experience in the world that's maybe different from mine. If I listen to learn, as opposed to listening for agreement, then I'm not going to be making my next argument in my head because that thing that you said, that was garbage. And here's how I can prove to you it's garbage. If I'm listening for what's important to you, how has your life been different from mine? What do I have to learn from you and your experience? Then you're going to have that experience just like Dana had, where you feel heard. You feel important. You know you belong because of how I'm listening. Any questions? And thanks. For those of you who are streaming, the question is really about organizational leaders and the fact that sometimes our pearls with the curls are our organizational leaders. And so how can we help bring them along? And what am I doing in particular around the area of emotional intelligence? So I am, in fact, an emotional intelligence practitioner. I've been to school for it. And so I do work inside of organizations. I'm an OD person. So I work inside of organizations to address sort of systemic issues. And I always start with the CEO. I don't know what it is about me. I spent a decade in the trash industry. That may be it. I am able to say things to men that are hard to hear that somehow they accept from me. If I knew what it was, I would share it with all of you. I have no idea what it is about me. Something motherly, that I'm heavy. I don't know what it is. But maybe it's my Southern roots. Yeah, I don't know. But I can say things, especially to men, that they do not want to hear, and they will accept it. And it's part of my secret sauce to say, there's a problem in your organization. And I can tell you there's a problem in your organization because we've done some testing and we've talked to your people. That's how I almost always start an engagement. Do some testing, figure out what's going on in the organization, because there's a huge disconnect between what organizational leaders think the experience is of our people and what people actually experience on a day-to-day. So here's what's happening in your organization. And buddy, part of the problem is you. A big part of it. So if you want something different to happen here, it's got to start with you. So I do executive coaching then with organizational leadership, and almost always end up bringing in emotional intelligence because, you know, it's the key thing that we were never taught in school. It's the key thing that in order to really be a great leader, to be a great manager, you've got to know how to manage and motivate people. And as we heard about this morning, most leaders got into leadership because they were great individual performers. And as we also know, 90% of managers have never been trained how to manage anybody. And so that's also part of what I do. Any other questions? And we've got 30 whole seconds before we're out of time. Great. Thank you so much. I'm actually going to sit down on the edge of the stage, and if anybody wants to have a quick chat, I'd be happy to do that. Otherwise, hope to see you online. Thanks.